Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. A big shout out to our new listeners from India, New Zealand, Netherlands, Chile, Romania, Argentina, Peru, Guam, Haiti, Hong Kong, Singapore, Spain, Taiwan, Turkey, Brazil, and South Korea. This episode, we are continuing our discussion on the poetry collection Guillotine by Eduardo C. Corral for National Poetry Month. Today we will be discussing the second half of the collection, discussing the major connections and themes seen in our selected pieces from this half.
Awesome.
Wow.
You
Shout out to all the new listeners.
I know. It's quite a few countries, and some are actually not that new, but we just had never thought about giving a shout out to some of these countries that have accumulated these past. We've been doing this for a couple years or something, right? I don't even remember anymore, but
It's been a little bit.
We celebrated 1 year anniversary lately. Yeah. Or is it 2? Yeah.
Something like about to be 2, I think.
Yeah,
It's about to be 2.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. So want to welcome y'all wherever you are in the far ends of this earth. We're ready and rested and bed to finish a book about starvation and about hunger, and I hope you all have been able to keep up with the previous discussion on it. And ideally, of course, if you're able to pick up a copy, as usual, and support these writers of ours. How are you guys doing, by the way?
Doing good.
Yes. No, I'm doing great, thanks. You doing well?
Doing good too.
Nice. Hey.
The second half is and actually before we get to the second half, a clarification on the first half. So remember that poem that we talked about, Nuestra Señora? It wasn't titled that, but it was about repeating Nuestra Señora the Señora de las Sombras. I interpreted, I was way off. So I mentioned, to me it seemed like Señora de Guadalupe, right? The Virgen de Guadalupe. But I should have rechecked the notes again, because it's actually the Señora being Santa Muerte. So it's another reference to Santa Muerte, as she's referred to, Señora de las Sombras. And so just wanted to clarify that, because, those kinds of things that you notice after you listen to an episode and you're rereading the book. So.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, that's right. We did talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I like about this work. The notes are there. You don't always get notes like that if you do at all. But let's get to the second half. So the second half begins with that double dagger that we've seen and talked about, and the words of Luis Muñoz, taken from a poem of his, Lo que no duele ha dolido, which roughly translates to what doesn't hurt has hurt, right? So it's an interesting kind of turn of phrase, and it's what encapsulates most of the second half of the collection. There's like 1 or 2 more double daggers. That takes us to the title poem, and being Guillotine, on 39. We've talked about the guillotine before, if you all remember, right? From part 2, there was a reference to the guillotine, but this is a poem that is titled as such. What did you guys make of this one after, talking and looking at the water station barrel eprastic pieces?
Well, to me, I think the scorpions represent Border Patrol agents.
Interesting.
Because there's one line towards the middle of the page, the scorpions, dark green. And I just thought of Border Patrol agents in their uniform.
Yeah, and they do pose a type of imminent threat, which I think is what a guillotine does. And so, after all, this is the title poem of the entire collection. One of the things that I'm noticing here from the second half is that, much like many of the other collections we've looked at, there's a lot of intertextuality in that we've seen authors use a lot of the similar symbols and imagery throughout many of their pieces. And whether it's intentional or not, it's something that you can pick up on. For example, the scorpions, right? Is I think it's not their first appearance in this text. I believe in the previous episode we even drew attention to the line where doesn't like a rosary or beads turn into scorpion
Yes.
as well. So you also start to see the appearance of a lot of mirrors, right? And so, with the imagery of mirrors, you always think about imagery of self and how we see ourselves reflected back to us. So it's a very interesting piece. It's very you used the word during the pre-show discussion, Jorge, but a lot of these are very personal, it seems. And you see the author. I mean, again, always try not to conflate the author with the voice of the poem, because obviously there are a lot of poems in here where the voice is not the author. But there is a very personal element into a lot of these pieces of intimacy, not just with oneself, but even with others. And so, I think I hadn't even seen that aspect that you had mentioned, Vanessa, of the Border Patrol. But I can see that because their presence is also throughout the book, and it's a looming one. And again, you think of what a guillotine is. It's a device meant for specific use, right? It comes up, comes down. When it comes down, it's supposed to be violent, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's just such. Corral uses very interesting images of animals and transformation, and some of it's very like psychoanalytic, where I'm trying to like, wonder what's happening here. Where
Yeah.
I kind of have to pause and think a little bit more deeply on what this image could possibly represent. And I think oftentimes an image can mean more than one thing, right? But also, I really liked at the end of 39. I really liked this line. What it is, guillotine, pause, tilt the blade, a threat, a reminder. It's my task to stop yearning. So, and then of course, thinking about. Oh yeah, there's another thing. Monsoon storm accordions. He mentions monsoon accordions in another piece. So yeah, again, more of that intertextuality. And of course, the way this poem ends, I begin to sense the enormity of my body, the blade high in the air. For now, there's a sense of anxiety. So I think that does fit a lot with this, what people often experience during migration. And again, this book is filled with a lot of death and survival. And again, La Migra, right, that thread, and also not just that, but we've spoken of these Minutemen, and I think just that state of anxiety is captured in this idea of a guillotine up in the air, waiting for now. Right, those lines kind of encapsulate that anxiety for now. When's it gonna drop?
Yeah, I think y'all, made some really insightful comments. I hadn't seen the scorpion as Border Patrol, but yeah, this is one of those poems where you can talk to students about the symbolism, and just kind of talking about what do you guys think the scorpion symbolizes, and teaching symbolism, I think, can be a little hard with, not just with nonfiction, but with like novels, I think, but with poems, you can really just narrow it down, or at least think of the possibilities. So this would be a good poem for that. And the other thing is this poem, what you're saying about the imagery there, Richie, is that reading it does make you uncomfortable, like because of that imagery. You think about how the blade is entering the body, is traveling into your tongue, and you can't help but imagine that, right? So there's a discomfort from having read, or disconcerting the previous, the Water Station Barrow poems or pieces. And now it's more about the embodiment, and of course, being, of course, that we all are, um, it can be triggering, right? And so I think that's another thing that teachers could talk about with their students is, besides thinking about what does the poem mean, I think a very useful question is, how does it make you feel? And I remember that actually, that question actually from Elizabeth Acevedo. She was at a some conference or book festival. Someone asked her, how is it that teachers can teach your work? And she said, ask him how it makes him feel. And I think that's a very valid point of discussion. And I think sometimes we think too much about the craft and the form, that sort of, highfalutin stuff, right? But we forget about the fact that these students, of course, are also affected by these poems. So yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Did either of you have sentence or saguaro? I know you probably have lines from it, but my next one was autobiography, and I think we all had that one.
Well, I mean, just really briefly, I like some of the things he's doing in sentence. So it's a poem that's kind of, he took a line from another piece, right? As the notes indicate, Song of the Restless Wind, Don McKay, and he takes a line there, and I think it's a very intimate poem, right? And I think some of the imagery is pretty interesting, right? He unpacks his tools. It's a very loaded image, right? Of course, he's talking about cleaning wooden handles, rinsing metal, but of course, unpacking his tool also carries that very sexual connotation,
right?
And there's some very beautiful lines weaved here, and I try to make sure from time to time to also just point out lines and images that I think are crafted nicely or just have a nice reaction. And so I love the way it ends here. Gently, he hammers gold into a sentence. Gently, the sentence enters me. So it's very, again, personal, sexual. Yeah, I mean, I just kind of enjoyed it. Some of the imagery of koi and eternity inked on his skin.
Yeah. So, and some of those lines are just kind of a couple words, and they can be standalone because of how this particular poem, like the one before it, is structured, right? It has that spacing in between a single line. And with saguaro, we get the monsoon accordion that you mentioned, Richie, and that intertextuality, which you made a really good point of, with going back to Thrown in the Throat, going back to Some Are Always Hungry, going back to Grise's collection, right? We see a lot of those recurring motifs, right? And so this is a poem that has some of that. And it's interesting as well because, you do kind of zoom out a little bit and think about how the writer thought about what to include, right? Because of course, ultimately the writer had to make the work cohesive. And it wasn't, a collection isn't just about putting everything you've written into one single object, right? So I think there's that too, and the progression, right, of each piece, how one piece kind of flows into the next. But with Autobiography of My Hungers, it's about a page and a half, and the title is actually the title of one of the memoirs by Rigoberto Gonzalez. And so Rigo is a Chicano poet. He's won a ton of awards. So, I don't think I even need to tell you about him, because if you're listening to this, you probably already know who he is. But if you haven't, I think definitely a poet that you should check out, and a writer, I should say. Um, and I think you all actually met him, right, at like one of the AWP or what have you, briefly.
I did, yeah.
Yeah. And he's been to EPCC before through, so he's actually visited our students before. So that's always neat. But anyway, so that's the title. And, we've talked a lot about hunger. We've talked a lot about, like you said, the personal, Richie, right? And what could be more personal than the autobiography and autobiography. So this particular poem is also about the relationship, that is expressed between the speaker and this unrequited love, and also there's a lot here that reminds me a little bit again of Thrown in the Throat, because of how the speaker expresses a kind of is kind of still wrapping their head around their body, right? Like what body positivity, I think, is an important thing, and this is a poem that wrestles with that. I think we've seen that before, and I mentioned Thrown in the Throat as well, because in that one, we get the queer body and embodied in the speaker and several of the pieces. So there's a lot of interesting imagery in this one, and there's dialogue. It begins and ends with a similar phrase, an avalanche of honey is what it begins with, and it ends with that as well. So those are my initial thoughts, but what else did you all think? I see a lot of annotations from y'all.
He's just looking at all of our stuff.
Hey man, what the?
It's personal. I'm just kidding. Well, it's definitely a different type of hunger than I think some of the other poems that we've talked about with hunger.
Mm-hmm.
This one's more about desire, I feel like, and that the yearning, which is obviously like a big thing in the second half. I think there's a lot of repetition also, and I feel like that's representative of like how much the speaker wants this relationship, because he's just thinking about it.
Strong lines that jumped out at you in particular?
One of them was weight loss is one of the first symptoms. And I thought that was interesting because, at least in my family, the idea of like, oh, when you're in love, you stop eating, you lose a lot of weight. And so that was interesting because to see that kind of mirrored and like wanting that love. And then also just the way that people treat one another after they've been treated a certain way. So the one towards the middle of the page, it says, I don't love you, he said. The words flung him back. In his eyes, I saw it. To another bar where a woman sidestepped his desire. So because this man was rejected, he now rejects someone who wants him.
Yeah. I think you mentioned the body image aspect. You see it present in other pieces as well. Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept. Like that kind of equation to hunger, to yearning, to body image. And I think it's an interesting image of after his first kiss, his mother telling him he looks thinner. So he's kind of having this moment with like cake, kind of just eating it by the hand, licking the buttercream off. And that's kind of interesting coping mechanism is the food. Is that talking hunger in that kind of way? But my strong line is on the next page on 44. I just like that. I starve myself by yearning for intimacy that doesn't and won't exist. That's a kind of emotional pang, like a hunger pang, but emotionally, right? I think many of us maybe have identified with at least once or twice in our lives, yearning for an intimacy that it won't exist. Like that definitely does hurt a certain way.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting reflection, I think, on intimacy with someone else. And as we see in another poem, you definitely can have it. Doesn't have to be a sexual relationship. I'm referring to kind of the hand holding poem later on in the collection, but I also do like how the poem has that parallelism.
Mhm.
It starts with honey and thorns,
Mhm.
and honey. It's like it's an interesting bookend.
Mhm.
Speaking of his beard,
Mhm.
an avalanche of thorns, an avalanche of honey. It's that kind of that sweetness with the rough aspects of it.
Mhm.
I don't know. Would you get out of that?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, y'all make really good points. First, the weight loss thing is interesting, Vanessa, because having just taught Jose's collection, y'all remember you go fat when you're in love.
Yeah, I was thinking the
Yeah.
other way actually. Yeah.
So compare and contrast. I think those teachers out there, I think you could compare and contrast it with that one. And the other thing is, you mentioned the thing about the cake, right? And those are some of my favorite lines because of how vivid they are, and how the speaker here throws in the word smuggling, and it brings up another kind of connotation, right? Because later on there's a poem about drop houses, which we can get to. And then, of course, the ones before that, right? We talked about the coyotes and all that, in the ekphrastic. So I smuggled the cake into my room. I ate it with my hands, licked buttercream off my thumbs until I puked. I just really like the flow of those lines, and the imagery in them, and how they're a response to, like you said, that I know there's fat shaming, but I guess, what do they call the opposite? Then fat, body shaming, I guess, in general.
what's Dobia?
Yeah, just in general.
Yeah, and that's, of course, it shows, like you said, the coping mechanism, a bit of trauma, a kind of course, an unstable relationship with their parent. And yeah, I had also marked down that line that you just said was your strong line, and I think you did too, right, Vanessa? Picking again into your
Yeah.
yeah. Anything else on Cordoba? Is a poem about mirrors, right? And you said, Richie, that there's a lot of recurring imagery, and so mirrors is one of them. You mentioned this autobiography as a reflection, right? Here we get the literal reflection. My reflection bleeds. It says in the second stanza here. I like the line in the second to last stanza, because it brings again in the Border Patrol agent poem. I don't touch mirrors. It's wrong. My father always said, to touch a man. Man, like, that's a very interesting couplet and volta, you could say. And again, going back to the father, I think the speaker in another poem had talked about the father too, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, that was my strong line that I underlined too.
Yeah.
The ending there. Right. We're all on the same page.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. Yeah, again, you have the appearance of the mirror, and I do think it is interesting. The word bleeds here, like functions. It is also literal, but also because he's bled on the mirror, it sounds like, right? It's toothpaste and it's smeared with blood. So the reflection, like, there's literally bleeding because there's just blood and it's smeared. So it's kind of, it bleeds into another aspect of himself, and it's his own self-image is not clear. And you can tell that this aspect of what his father has told him, right? It's wrong to touch a man. Sticks with him.
And the self-love here, right? I feel we've talked about that with you know, some other poem or book, whatever it was.
You get a sense of like maybe that shame
Mm-hmm.
of him
Mm-hmm.
trying to understand himself.
Mm-hmm. Before we do get to the Border Patrol agent, which we mentioned last time, and now that I think about it, we could add it to the notes for the episode. So we could add the link to the video reading by Eduardo. But did you all have anything on questions for my body?
I think it's interesting how it's a bunch of questions, but there aren't any question marks. They're all kind of open.
Mm-hmm. Open-ended questions. Yeah.
You have the presence of the cake again.
Mm-hmm.
Corral, like a bunch of our other writers, references other writers. So in this case, you have Keats.
Mm-hmm.
Do you laugh or cry at Keats' grave? I thought that was an interesting one. I think in the literary world, that's been a lot of speculation. Is the whole story behind Keats' gravestone?
Oh, what's the story?
Well, it was a matter of how he wanted what he wanted on there. So famously, the lines that are there is, "Here lies one whose name was written in water." Apparently it's been related. There's a lot of documentation on this and a lot of like speculation, like that's all he wanted on the grave. If you look at it, if you just Google it, and it is in Italy, in Rome, I believe. It's just a lot more to it than that. So it's just kind of one of those things, is like his wish being fulfilled or not. The line did make it on the gravestone,
Yeah,
because that's what he wanted. But there's all this other extra stuff, like "Here lies a grand," I can't remember specifically, so I'm not gonna riff on that. But I think I wonder if that's what he means by laughing or crying at the grave, like just to see it, and maybe being misrepresented or understood, or like maybe not having your wishes, or just to be there in front of like a literary great.
Yeah, I think all of those things.
Have you been claimed?
That was probably my strong line.
Yeah.
The set of questions here about the body, right? I think expressed that the insecurities and the inadequacies, and the question here: do you still fear the virus? Right? And
that one hit differently, right?
Huh? Oh, because of Corona.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, also really like, has cruelty ever saved you? This makes me think of what Vanessa was just saying about how we do to others what has been done to us. This is kind of one of those. I think that question is almost a reflection of that, right? Has that ever made us feel better for doing,
Yeah. So moving on to page 47, the next poem, Border Patrol Agent. We talked about it a little bit last time, and again we'll add the link to the reading by Eduardo in the show notes. It's a poem where, like La Migra by Pat Mora, the persona is that of a BP agent. And so seeing things from their perspective, that there's a lot here of, the language that they use to communicate on the radio. There's the mirror again that we had seen. And there's, of course, the references to the bodies that this agent finds in the desert, with some really strong and definitely, I think, triggering imagery as well.
Yeah.
What did you all make of this one? And especially, now that we kind of saw Eduardo or heard him read it from that Ars Poetica production.
Well, I really liked the second kind of stanza there, talking about "I hate the rearview mirror. It makes me look like my father." And of course, it's not just any kind of mirror, but in this case, the rearview mirror is always about looking back to your past.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a great setup to thinking about a father. Now this is a different speaker than the other poem, right?
Mm-hmm.
But still thinking about generational uh, concerns, I guess, or what we carry with us. In this case, our speaker, a Mexican American border patrol agent, I think
Mm-hmm.
is a key element here.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know for many, it's a confounding aspect when someone who has a background, a Mexican background,
Mm-hmm.
goes into that kind of line of work. Um, and I felt like I wanted to bring it up in the previous episode in some of the poems, but there is a tendency that I think when it comes to immigration,
Mm-hmm.
that people overcompensate the American side,
Mm-hmm.
like to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this is a kind of a common thing that people also relate to when they join the border patrol. Because you can tell he's trying to leave that side of himself, because he also references later on, I only speak Spanish with my father.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's kind of leaving that behind.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's always kind of one of the more interesting looks at identity issues
Mm-hmm.
through this type of character. And of course, you see through his eyes, you see kind of some of the perils of the desert and the desert crossings and immigration.
Mm-hmm.
The danger for a lot of those settlers. Like you said, a lot of that visceral imagery
Mm-hmm.
comes out. And yeah, it's a very interesting take.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a persona poem, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The whole thing that you mentioned about the overcompensating for the American identity is interesting, and I I think you mentioned this, Vanessa, in the first episode, the part one, about the erasure, right? Because we got that from ceremonial. I mean, so I guess it's part two. So we see that here very clearly, right, with like their identity, and it's a kind of I guess a part coping mechanism, part um compartmentalization on the part of the agent for how they can justify, you know, the way that they end up the in the job that they end up doing, you know.
You also have the racial epithets
Right.
kind of thrown
Mm-hmm.
wet, and then
Yeah, and those I definitely the ones that they use. I think you can find it on Google. Like the border patrol terminology is rooted in that kind of racism. Um, they have a lot, and I think it's covered in like Luis Alberto Orea's book.
Also, there's that line, "God is always hungry,"
Mm,
which in the previous episode we had mentioned that, I think, was it you, Vanessa? You
the
pointed
vulture.
out the vulture,
Yeah.
right? And this idea of them circling around,
Mhm.
also being hungry, and
Mhm.
kind of brings me back to that.
And the fact that it's graffiti as well, because the phrastic, that we talked about that, right, where there's different words on the, on those barrels, right?
Mhm.
And so here we get the graffiti, and this time it's not on something that is artificial, but it's on Mother Nature itself, right? The boulder, and I can't help but think of the with graffiti, they always talk about it as like, is it street art or is it like vandalism, right? Like I'll give you guys an example, like with Waco tanks, that's one of the sites, right? That go ahead.
No, I don't want to go over saying.
No.
I'll add to it.
Well, that was one end of it, right? And then of course, that one is Mother Nature itself, right? But there's also like I was driving in Northeast where I'm at, and on a bus stop, they had put in like, I guess these would like probably some kids or whatever, but a pentagram and then 666 on it, and green graffiti, and and so basically just like how these messages are conveyed in different ways, and in some cases it's like just young people trying to be cool or whatever, right? To impress.
Edgy.
Yeah. But in the other, it takes on a bigger significance of the land itself.
Right, because when you mentioned Hueco tanks, I think back, well, it's also, a anthropological site. There's a sacred historical value placed on that land, which also makes it, more troublesome when people graffiti in that area.
Did you have thoughts on this, Vanessa? And
just the imagery, like the just violence against migrants. Yeah, and even just like towards the top where it says, "I found a body, legs nod to the knees, barbed wire tight around the throat." It's just crazy to think like people are going and doing things like this to people who are just trying to do better for themselves and their families. And it's not always like, because a lot of times it is, not a lot of times, but in some cases it is the gangs that they're trying to like escape from that are coming and finding them. But in other cases it's people from the US who are doing it. And it's just like interesting to see the different perspectives of like, or different people attacking this one group.
Yeah, I think we've talked about how they're victimized on both ends, where once they get here, they can still fall prey, not just to, of course, the elements, but those radical militia groups that you mentioned, Richie. But then there's also, the journey itself, right? You talked about La Bestia and how the Mexican government, or, you get that in the book, Enrique's Journey by Sonia Nazaro, I think is her name, and so it really is a kind of never-ending threat, and it does, of course, relate back to what the Efrastic was trying to point out. So it's kind of an interesting other side of the coin in this one. But it doesn't, of course, do the BP any favors, and it ends with that ghastly imagery of the baby caskets. And the referencing that there are things that the BP agent is keeping to themselves, right? Because they're not even relaying it to their partner. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and even implies even more compartmentalization, right, of the things that they see on the field that they're keeping to themselves. But then that also brings up the problematic issue of, well, if they talk about this rape tree, right? I mean, kind of mentioned it in passing almost, right? It seems that's, well, what else are they keeping from their partner? Next up is a very similar poem, because it's also about a Border Patrol agent. And Song of the Open Road, taken from Whitman. This poem, I want to say, is taken from No Tender Fences, which is a great anthology that, if you all haven't checked out, it's immigrant and first-generation American poets. And, those of us here on the border, we know about in a general sense, right, about how CBP, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol, can just stop you within the 100-mile radius, and so it brings to mind that the border isn't just the wall, or that Rio Grande, right? It's it extends beyond it, right? And so the border is in the eyes of the immigration agents. It's far beyond that. And so this is just taken directly from their policy of, you know, reasonable suspicion, the reasons why they can stop someone. And it's interesting in this one how the body is that phrase that is bracketed,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and you know, because you could think of a lot of ways of that, how that is represented, you know, what it means. And also the reasons themselves, you know, some of them, of course, are just kind of spurious, right? Like paying undue attention to the agent. You know, some of these things you realize are like totally subjective, right? Like they're hardly, they could hardly be, they're more pretext than they are actual valid reasons for putting someone over. Not to mention the fact how problematic it is to pull someone over when they're not even at the border anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting the arbitrary nature of you know, it almost seems like if you look like you're trying to avoid them, suspicious, or, you know, too much attention. You fit on either end of that, like.
Like, have you all, if I may ask, and if you're comfortable sharing, have you all, you know how like you get past Las Cruces, right? There's the Border Patrol checkpoint, or any checkpoints for that matter. Have you all had any of those kinds of experiences where you just felt it wasn't a good encounter? Or
I think I've mentioned it on this show. I can't remember for which. Might have been. Oh, this is early on. Yeah, I remember talking about it. Only when I traveled by myself. Yes.
Yeah.
If I was always with like someone else traveling to like Albuquerque or somewhere, be fine. But you know, the few times I was by myself, it's very intimidating if they stop you and ask you to pull over, because then they kind of bring out the dogs. They sniff around. You feel like guilty for no reason, but like a little scary. Like if they decide. I remember one time I was traveling to Albuquerque with my roommate, so two brown dudes in a truck, and yeah, we got pulled over, but they had like 7 or 8 officers walk out and stand by, like, you know. That was very intimidating. Yeah, it was like 7 or 8 officers like kind of standing around with the dogs going around. It's just like, this seems like very extra
legal, you know, because you think about the Fourth Amendment, right, and unreasonable search and seizures,
right. Body, yeah, I mean the emphasis on body again. In this case, we're kind of talking about the vehicle,
right?
But
yeah, I mean, it goes back again to how a lot of these poems are embodied, right? And so, you know, it brings to mind how, of course, a lot of these bodies, right, quote unquote, and I mean literally, right, ended up in the desert, you know, victim in some way or another. So yeah, it's definitely a powerful poem. Which of y'all did y'all have next? Mine wasn't until 54.
Yeah.
Same?
Yeah.
Well, I guess on 53, I just think that's a nice tribute. Yeah, it's just kind of him about giving tribute, and I just think there's some interesting points here, like learning Spanish as a colonial tongue. But I just think the beautiful aspect is this aspect of talking about a fifth direction. Some Mesoamerican elders believe there's a fifth direction. Sorry. Yeah, did I say dimension first time?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I really liked his discussion of the fifth direction, right? Because you know, in the ritual, he talks about the smudging, burning of sage, and then praying in directions, the 4 cardinal directions. And so expanding on that, it's talking about the fifth direction,
Mm-hmm.
not the sky or the ground, because that's kind of natural where we might go. Well, where would that be?
Mm-hmm.
But instead, it's the person right next to you. So
Mm.
just, I think that's nice at the end. I'm turning to face you, maestro. I'm greeting you,
Mm-hmm.
which I imagine is not what.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, and like you said, I think paying homage to our predecessors, right? And Francisco Alarcón, one of them. Um, I also like that line that you mentioned about the Spanish being a colonial tongue, and I like how there's these kind of terms of endearment, right? Copal, popote, tocayo, cacahuate, different ways of referring to him.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the beginning was also interesting. You made tomatoes laugh and warned me some words die in cages. That idea of being locked up and the idea of putting things on the page as well. I get from that. Although, of course, these days cages has a whole other significance when it comes to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think we had around every circle another can be drawn, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So this poem is split into two sections, and like some of the other poems, it references their personal experience and the speaker has with their identity. They're getting bullied for being gay, right? I
Mhm.
kissed a guy. And it also references Federico Garcia Lorca, who was a Spanish poet. And as is mentioned here, he was assassinated by the fascist regime. And, that there's speculation on whether he died, being because he was gay, right? And it's something that would not be surprising, right? And he's got the line there, one of my strong lines. The soldier who shot Lorca bragged he fired 2 bullets into his ass for being queer. For years, I desired a man who didn't desire me. He was gentle with my lust. And then in parentheses, we get, I never thanked him. I'm thanking him now. Those lines just really jumped out at me.
Mhm.
That in part because of the sexual violence, but also in part because of how it goes back to the other points, right, about unrequited love and about I like how it's the only thing that's parenthetical
Yeah.
about thanking him.
Yeah, it's like the authorial moment stepping out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also what I was referencing to when we were talking about autobiography of my hungers.
Mm.
Was that part you just read?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Who he's thinking?
Mm.
Once in a splinter-rich booth, he held my hand. A kindness I can't forget.
Mm-hmm. Vanessa, what jumped out at you from this one?
That line, you guys already talked about it.
Well, did it jump out at you for the same reasons as us?
It definitely seems like a different person that he's talking about to me.
Mm.
So this time it's him desiring someone who didn't desire him.
Mm-hmm.
But this time they're gentle with him.
Mm.
And that's why he's thanking them. Because they didn't abuse him the same way that he has been abused.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think, like you said, because of the authorial comment there's a sense of how the written word and verse in particular can act as a kind of closing of the book, right? Because so much of the guts that we spill on the page, and I think if y'all remember the interview with Benjamin Science that we had. He talked a little bit about this, about how much he put into the work, right? And in that collection of his, the Kentucky, Everything Begins in, it's the Kentucky Club. And I think it's something that is not talked about too much. How is it that, I mean, we all talk about books and reading as like therapeutic, but there's a sense of how a poem can do much more than it can with its craft. because of how interlaced we are with what we're writing about. This isn't like the persona poem, with the PP agent, right? There's a personal element in here, right? And it's woven with the kind of tribute to Lorca, right? As a poet that is admired and who died so tragically because of simply loving someone else, and because of what he did. I think it also kind of hits a little different when we kind of see a rise in that kind of fascism, right? That was in the 30s, right before World War II. And I think it's sad that we're still seeing the kind of neo-fascistic thinking in all parts of the world, but I think particularly in the U.S. The title of the piece,
It's Emerson, right?
Emerson, yeah. And I like on the second section on 55. I don't know if you all had this one about God, where it says, what a saint said about God, I believe about loneliness, a circle whose center is everywhere and its circumference nowhere. And that's how the poem ends. I think that this collection has talked about God and personified God in different ways, right? As hungry. Here, it's contrast or compared with loneliness. So it speaks again to the kind of alienation that we're getting from the speaker in various pieces here.
Yeah, it's a great imagery. It's interesting the call to like the transcendentalists. 'Cause you already have the Whitman, and then you have Emerson now. And going back to just this idea of a circle, the point. Again, think of the vulture. What do? They circle around in the sky. Well,
yeah. We get another short poem, Commercial Break, right? Hence the title. To a Street Man.
You got Nike. That's the thing about Commercial Break, you have the violence again, but then it's like kind of like a Nike presence,
Yeah. And then, the ode to a street man. I mean, maybe we shouldn't call it an ode, but it's just, it's addressed to a street. It's an address to a street man. This is another poem that can be difficult to get through, again, because of the sexual violence that is perpetrated on the speaker. And afterward,
Although, sorry, I'm just realizing in the end of To a Street Man, you do have him touching his face, whereas in the other one with the mirror, he's pulled back. He has to kind of address after this horrific being attacked. I think it's almost tenderly. I think that's an interesting contrast between the poem where he doesn't touch his face, or he pulls his hand back, and now he is.
And you do wonder, right? What represents the shift in that tone and the motivation, right, for the speaker to kind of embrace, well, not embrace, but I don't know what you would call that, but a way of healing, right? Maybe a way of processing the trauma, at least.
Maybe recognizing you have to find it in yourself first, because you're calling out to someone and they're not there, right? So I wanted to yell as you vanished into a hotel to drink with your friends.
Yeah.
I mean, as you were kind of moving on to the next one, I was like, that's kind of
yeah.
I want to bring that up.
Postmortem is one that, per the notes, it's actually the lines that are answered and that are italicized, per the notes, are part of an assortment of Nahuatl proverbs. So I think it's an interesting composition, because he must have had the proverbs first. Well, I'm speculating here, but I'm assuming he had the proverbs first, and then he constructed these questions to serve as a kind of call and response. And you right now, I mean, you mentioned that the not touching themselves, right? The speaker at the end here, it says, "How do you remember him? I make a smudge." Going back to that other point, right, about the blood on the mirror. And so a lot of the similar themes here, addressing about some kind of sexual violence, or some kind of encounter without consent. What happened when he touched you? How did he make you feel? How did you cope? Right? Was it love or lust? And I like how it's kind of paired with different proverbs and how it kind of fit.
A very interesting way of fitting these.
Mm-hmm. And so that ends that section with the Luis Munoz double dagger and epigraph. And I think this is the last section. 1707 San Joaquin Avenue begins with the what's it called? Well, it's a snippet of an Associated Press clipping talking about what they call drop houses. So drop house being kind of this intermediary space where immigrants are held before they are smuggled or after they are smuggled. And so before they get to wherever they are going to be taken to as once they're, trafficked, right? So this referring to human trafficking. It's interesting how, I don't know if this was the speaker here, but illegal is scratched out. And I want to say it's the speaker, because I don't think the Associated Press that isn't using illegal as a noun. They kind of updated their AP guide, but
that was a fight for a good while though, to remove that from their usage.
Definitely. And so it's an interesting poem because it takes those words and it makes a poem out of that. According to the notes, no tables, no couch, no doors. Even the bathroom door is missing after that. It ends with the questions. Who smuggled you into the country? Un mexicano. Who brought you to the house? Un mexicano. Who took away your purse and cell phone? Un mexicano. Right? I like how this poem kind of calls out, the problematic nature of, not just the Border Patrol agent being Mexican American, but also a lot of these, of course, in the cartels, right? Smugglers are, of course, as well Mexican. Well, not of course, but it just that's what ends up happening, right? And how we see it demographically. And it's kind of a way of pointing the finger back of like, these are both the problem and the solution, right? In the sense that there are a lot of Mexican immigrants, who cross that border, but a lot of the coyotes, of course, are also Mexican and such.
Right. And then their voice, they talk about it's easier to hurt Centroamericanos. Those Indios snatching pinche trabajos that belong in our pinche gente. Like, you hear that same rhetoric, right? This has come up too, and in other stuff we read, right? That kind of hate, like the Indios, like they're taking like a little bit of that colorism, hating some of the indigenous aspects, and I mean it's a perspective you hardly see though here of that aspect of smuggling.
The polleros, as they call them in Spanish. Yeah. So it's another interesting persona poem. And I also like how it ends. The second to last section where it says, how did you make it through those days? When you hurt, you're not completely in the world. And again, talking about embodiment, right? Not just the physical body, but our presence, right? And how grounded we are. Did you have thoughts on that, Vanessa?
Yeah, just The idea of like coping mechanisms, I think, is something that is also seen throughout
Mm-hmm.
the collection.
It's
Oh, sorry.
no, I was just gonna say it's interesting. It's italicized too.
Mm.
But sorry, go ahead.
It's also similar to the previous sections, what you read earlier, lo que no duele ha dolido. Just kind of, to me, it kind of represents like this numbing, like it doesn't hurt anymore because you don't feel it. You kind of just shield yourself from that trauma.
Right. And I mean, that can take us to like a whole metaphysical rabbit hole about what is pain, right? And what does it mean to be hurt? What does it mean to be in pain? And it's of course not just the physical pain and trauma, but it's also the psychological pain. And in some ways, they kind of feed off each other, right? And the way that our body responds to it, it's a signal that something is not right. So we it's an important sense for us, right? Like there's people who forget what the condition is called, but there's a condition where they lose their sense of their tongue. So they end up biting their tongue off because they can't feel it anymore. Like at night, for instance. And just, I don't know, just really interesting kind of thinking about pain and its representation, its role in the body. And like you said, it's how we end up processing it, right? When it comes to healing, if we do at all. Pre-show, we talked about the names on page 69, which are not in the notes. So, we were kind of wondering if we would get some notes on this, but they all, like you were speculating, Richie, that perhaps these are names from the newspapers that are reference, the different articles from like the Intercept, etc. I think these days, it's I'm reminded of Alejandra's poem about the 23 victims of the Walmart shooting, where it ends with those names, right? And so here we get some more names, Talia, Jordi, Andres, Junior, Vicky. So some of them are superimposed upon each other. Some of them are repeated, right? Actually, I think maybe all of them are repeated in some way. And some of them kind of faded. So I think it's an interesting tribute to
a lot of names,
a lot of people, right? Yeah, a lot of names, both men and women. And you imagine, of course, there's a lot of children. And actually, so that wasn't the last section. This is the last section that begins after that. And I think it makes sense if that is what precedes it, because is it the last point?
Yeah.
Is to Juan Do 234. It's another poem where it does talk a lot about the migrants, right? And Border Patrol as well. To me, just the line in Border Patrol jargon, the word for border crossers is the same whether they're alive or dead. This one jumped out at me. I think, it goes to show how important it is that we have a humanitarian response, to a lot of this, right? And of course, it's an issue that's been around for decades. But I think it goes to show how, a lot of the dehumanization that happens just in the choice of words. You don't even have to go to the facts of like migrant X was, died or was killed or, ended up being sent back, where they ended up being victimized by cartels. Just like the other poem that was from the perspective of the BP agent. Lines that jumped out at you, or just thoughts on this one as the last poem?
One line that's kind of jumped out at me just now, like rereading it. Towards the beginning, it says, I think this one kind of deals with like the idea of sexuality also. So it says, we were taught to bring roses to aim for the bush. And then, so like for me, that kind of just talks like that kind of is dealing with his sexuality and the idea that this is what you're supposed to want.
Yeah. And I think, the symbolism of roses, we haven't gotten too many different kinds of plants, right? That I can remember. So, the saguaro, yeah.
That's also interesting. Just thinking like, because in the desert you think there's not a lot of life, and so now there's kind of like this switch into like the idea of roses and growing roses, like this idea of like hope that they had.
I mean, that's definitely one way to interpret it. I kind of interpret it the other way, Vanessa, of the end of life, because after the funeral, the last thing you do is you just leave a rose on top of the casket. And, at the end here, we get, yesterday our mother said, or in the middle, my high heels are killing me. Let's go back to the funeral. And it's a tenderness as well that we get with the food, right? This is one of the few ones that does mention food. Slow cooking a roast melts the tough tissue between the muscle fibers. Tender meat remains, which of course could be multivalent there, right? He's talked about tenderness, right? The tender touch. So, and it ends with the image of the mask, right? It was a mask. I thought I saw a face. I yanked it from your flesh. I wear it often.
That one's tough.
Yeah.
Just the idea of like wearing someone else's pain.
Yeah, that is interesting. And, it's the way that this collection comes to a close. So, we can't recommend it enough. I think this was our first time reading Eduardo's work. I want to check out some of his earlier stuff now, because this is his most recent work. And for National Poetry Month, right? So this was our book. But did y'all have anything to close with?
No, definitely looking forward. Checking out his first. Was it Slow Lightning? Was the first collection.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, brought to you by Border Census and Power at the Pass. This episode, we discussed Guillotine by Eduardo C. Corral. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode as we begin our discussion on Subduction by Kristen Milares Young. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.